This is a tritone. It sounds pretty harsh, clashing, unpleasant, or as a musician would say, dissonant. But if we bump that F sharp up to a G, we have a perfect fifth, which sounds pretty smooth, harmonious, kind of locked into a single sound, or as a musician would say, consonant. But why are these two intervals, which are so close together in size, so different in experience? Now you may think you know the answer to this question. I thought I did for many years. But it turns out that it's surprisingly nuanced in a way that hints at a fascinating possibility. The engineering of a special kind of sound in which the tritone is consonant and the perfect fifth is dissonant. Now before we go any further, I do want to mention that the terms consonant and dissonant have a wide variety of models and definitions in music theory and psychology. For example, this paper by Peter Harrison and Marcus Pierce, which I'll link to in the comments, contains this wonderful if somewhat overwhelming figure breaking down the concept of consonance into models based on harmonicity, interference, and culture. Because consonance and dissonance, like most aspects of perception, are as much about what you expect as what you experience. For this video though, I'm going to focus on the sensory rather than cultural aspects of consonance, in particular the ideas of interference and sensory roughness. But I wanted to show this graph right off the bat to communicate that, while I hope everything I say in this video is accurate, it's only a slice of the staggering amount of human time and attention that has gone into trying to understand this topic. Okay, so when I was younger, my model of what made an interval consonant or dissonant went something like this. Sounds are waves, and isn't it pretty when these waves line up really nicely? And to be honest, that model has a decent amount of explanatory power. For example, an octave is a 2-to-1 frequency ratio, which makes the sine waves line up just beautifully. And in general, simple ratios, like 3-to-2 for a perfect fifth or 5-to-4 for a major third, line up regularly and create a simple, consistent shape to the combined sound wave from cycle to cycle. But there's a problem. Listen to these two sine waves forming a beautiful, perfect fifth. Did you notice that it was out of tune? Instead of 440 Hz and 660 Hz, it was 440 and 650. That's over 25 cents flat of a perfect fifth. And with these frequencies, there's no more of that perfect alignment of the waves. Also, remember that locked-in sound of a true perfect fifth? Let me wiggle that upper pitch around a little bit. Now, maybe you have really well-trained ears and can hear exactly when it hits a true 3/2 ratio. But to me, there just isn't that sense of the interval locking in that I'm used to when I'm, say, tuning a violin. And the reason is because these are sine waves, not complex tones. But if it were about sound waves lining up with each other, you'd think sine waves would be probably the most noticeable. There's got to be something else going on here. Oh hey, real quick, if you were about to comment that you can actually hear it locking in with true sine waves, I made a little bonus video about that. Okay, so if it's not about this perfect mathematical alignment of waveforms, why is it that simple ratios seem to produce consonant intervals? Well, we can get some insight into this by listening carefully to our experience of dissonance as we take two sine waves starting on the same frequency and gradually pull them apart. Now, I'm willing to bet that if we were to graph how dissonant you found those two sine waves, we would start at 0, no dissonance when they're on the same pitch. And then as we pull them apart, it would quickly shoot up to a peak of dissonance round about here, after which the dissonance would start to subside as the two frequencies drift apart into clearly separate sounds. There are a couple possible explanations for this. One possibility, which you may have heard of, is that nearby frequencies cause a kind of interference called beating as they go into and out of phase with one another. But I'd actually like to focus on a more physiological explanation that has to do with how we hear. See, when we hear sounds, vibrations travel to this curled up snail-looking thing in our ears called the cochlea, which has a bunch of tiny little hairs that vibrate in response to different frequencies, ultimately triggering neurons to send messages to the brain. And if we could unroll the snail, we'd see that these hairs are arranged in a continuous, roughly logarithmic map of frequencies from around 20 Hz to 20,000 Hz. And every sound we hear gets decomposed into different patches of vibrating hair cells, telling our brains which frequencies are present. Now, because a sine wave is a pure sound, it activates a very specific region of those hair cells. But it's not pinpoint precise. There's a kind of width to the activation, with nearby hair cells getting activated as well. So when we pull two sine waves apart, at first they're activating roughly the same region, and the brain hears a single unified tone. But as they drift apart, the signal gets muddier. The brain starts to ask, is this one tone or two? It becomes ambiguous. Then eventually, when the frequencies are far enough apart, it clicks into place. Ah, this is two separate tones. And according to this theory, the peak dissonance occurs in that region of maximum confusion, where the brain can't quite resolve if it's one or two tones. Now, one piece of evidence supporting this theory is that interval of maximum dissonance seems to vary based on frequency, because the cochlea doesn't have equal resolution across all frequencies. In particular, we're less good at resolving low frequencies than high frequencies. In fact, back in the 1960s, acoustic scientists proposed a new kind of scale called the Bark scale, a perceptual scale that kind of rebalances the Hertz scale based on our ear's pitch resolution. So I actually made a fancy Desmos graph to help us understand this. So I like to think of the Bark scale as kind of mapping out positions along the cochlea. So here on the x-axis, we have frequencies in Hertz, and on the y-axis, we have Bark. And if I turn on the sound and kind of move the frequency around, you can kind of see where along that hairy snail inside of our ear, the hairs are being activated. Now where this gets interesting is when we introduce a second frequency. And since the idea is that dissonance occurs when the signals are too close together on the cochlea, we can actually overlay a dissonance curve, which tells us how dissonant two sine waves should be based on how much they're interfering with each other on the cochlea. Check it out. So you may be wondering, like, why don't I just use a long frequency scale? Why do we have to use this fancy Bark scale? I mean, isn't it just kind of about the ratio between the frequencies? But it's not, because our frequency resolution is worse in the lower register. Right now, I have it set to a frequency ratio of 1.25, which is a major third. And you can see and hear that there's not much interference going on when the lower pitch is 1,300 Hertz. But let's see what happens when we take that same ratio and bring it down into the lower register. Can you hear that muddiness, that kind of lack of clarity to the sound? That sensory dissonance is a result of our ears not being able to distinguish the frequencies as readily in that register. And you can actually see it on the graph. 160 Hertz is roundabout an E below middle C, not even that low. And you know, this difference in pitch resolution between low and high registers really affects the way composers have written music. We maybe don't tend to use the word dissonant for a low major third. We might say it's muddy instead or something. But this is part of the reason that composers have tended towards sonorities that feature larger intervals at the bass and smaller intervals up top. And yeah, I know, that's also the structure of the harmonic series. And in a way, like, which came first? Our auditory system is based in part on the fact that we hear a lot of harmonic series all around us. But still, I personally find this graph to be particularly illuminating as far as dissonance is concerned. Want to try this graph for yourself? I put it up for free on Patreon. There's also some other stuff there that's even cooler that you can pay for. Okay, so we're getting closer to building a consonant tritone, and I promise it's going to be pretty cool when we get there. But the next step is going to be able to take this understanding that we've got of sine wave dissonance and apply it to more complex tones like a trumpet or a violin. So this description of sensory dissonance involving the hairs on our cochlea explains why intervals that are really tight, like a minor second, would be dissonant. But why is a tritone dissonant? And why do intervals with simple frequency ratios, like a perfect fifth or a major third, have that feeling of consonance or harmonic fusion? Well, ultimately what it comes down to is that most of the instruments that we're used to hearing have harmonic spectra, meaning that instead of a single frequency, what we're hearing is a stack of frequencies, all of which are multiples of the lowest fundamental frequency. In the violin, for example, this happens because strings are one-dimensional, and one-dimensional mediums like this naturally vibrate not only as a whole, but in halves, thirds, fourths, fifths, and so on. See, when you hear a note played on the violin, the string is actually vibrating in all of these different modes simultaneously. It's kind of like a chord of sine waves. And because the frequency of vibration is inversely proportional to the length of the vibrating section, a string tuned to a fundamental frequency of, say, 200 Hertz will also vibrate at 400 Hertz, and 600 Hertz, and 800, 1000, and so on. And this isn't just string instruments too. Other instruments like brass and woodwinds behave similarly because their sound production is based on setting up vibrations in a thin, coiled tube of air, which is also nearly one-dimensional. So the whole reason I actually made this video is that back when I was TAing a music composition class, I made a little toy program to visualize how the frequencies of harmonic spectra align when the fundamentals are in simple ratios with one another. Okay, so here's that program I wrote as a grad student, and it depicts a spectrum with a single sine wave, which sounds like this. Next, I'm going to add a harmonic spectrum above that sine wave, so that you can hear each partial enter one at a time. I'm curious, by the way, whether you have the same experience that I have, which is that as the sine waves enter, I can hear them each individually. But then when I move them as a block up or down, they merge into a single timbre. What that is our brain recognizing them as probably coming from a single sound source. And our brains are always working on this kind of source separation problem. Anyway, where this gets interesting is when we add a second note, a second stack of harmonics, like this. And if we drag the frequency of the top note around, we can see that there are certain ratios, like the perfect fifth here, where the harmonics line up really well. See, because the fundamentals are in a 3:2 ratio, the second harmonic of this top note is at exactly the same frequency as the third harmonic of the bottom note. Similarly with the fourth and sixth and ninth, and so on. So if we think back to that sensory dissonance curve, the sound as a whole is going to be consonant when harmonics either line up really perfectly or stay pretty far away from one another. And look, that's what we see right here. This harmonic is slotted right in between these two, whereas this one lines up perfectly here. This one's slotted in between, lining up, in between, lining up, and so on. You get this same effect with other simple ratios like the major third, 5:4. Or the minor third, 6:5. Or maybe a just seventh. Notice in this case that the fourth harmonic of the upper tone is lining up with the seventh harmonic of the lower tone. And of course this one's not quite as good as like the perfect fifth, because you can see some of the harmonics are close to clashing. They're creating probably some degree of sensory dissonance. So yeah, that's what this program looked like before I started making this video. But in the course of making this video, I got a little bit obsessed and I added a dissonance calculator and a little graph that shows how dissonant you are at every ratio. Check it out. So we start over here with a unison, which is of course perfectly consonant. But watch what happens when I drag the upper pitch back and forth. And I'm currently at a kind of local minimum of the perfect fifth. But look just a little bit to the left of the perfect fifth. There's the tritone. And the tritone is dissonant because the fifth is consonant. Because if the fifth makes all of the sine waves line up, the tritone makes them just off of one another, which creates this sense of sensory dissonance. I mean, I could just look at this graph forever. I just love the way that it shows the whole kind of topography of consonance and dissonance. So that's why intervals like a perfect fifth sound consonant, whereas a tritone sounds dissonant. But then how on earth am I going to make a consonant tritone? Well, the key is that all of this was based on the even spacing of the harmonic series, which resulted from one-dimensional vibrating mediums like strings and tubes. But not all vibrating mediums are one-dimensional. Instruments like cymbals, gongs, and timpani have two-dimensional vibrating surfaces, and as a result, they have a totally different vocabulary of resonant modes. Instead of resonating in evenly spaced segments separated by stationary nodal points, 2D surfaces vibrate in all sorts of fascinating patterns, with vibrating areas separated by nodal curves. One of my favorite visualizations of this is done by scattering sand on a vibrating plate. At certain resonant frequencies, the plate locks into one of its many fascinating vibrational patterns. And instead of forming an even stack of harmonics, instruments like this form uneven, inharmonic spectra. So what does this mean for our experience of consonance and dissonance? Well, take a listen to this. This is the sound of a carillon, a bell-like instrument traditionally found at the top of a university's most phallic building. And when you analyze the sound of a carillon, its peak frequencies look like this. Here, let's build them up in my little visualizer. The first two frequencies, as usual, form an octave. Although the bottom octave is much quieter than the upper octave, which is interesting. But then after that, the next frequency goes up not by a perfect fifth, but by a minor third. We then get another copy of the main octave, followed by a fourth, a second, a tritone, and some other weird intervals. So you know what we have to do. We have to add a second copy and see which intervals are consonant. The minimum dissonance, maximum consonance, occurs with a pitch ratio of 1.2, or a minor third. And in a way that's not that surprising. You can see right here that because the minor third is in the spectrum, when you transpose up by a minor third, two of the main sine waves line up perfectly. You'll also notice that the sine waves that don't line up aren't really interfering with one another. But what about intervals like the octave, fifth, perfect fourth, and major third? Traditionally the most consonant intervals. Well, we can see here that the major third, not so good. The fourth is also not great. The fifth is fairly consonant, but not as consonant as the minor third. And then the octave? Ugh. You can see on the dissonance graph that the octave is actually pretty dissonant on a carillon. And the reason is that, despite the fact that the lower octaves line up really nicely, in the upper register we have some interference between pretty strong harmonics. And you know, the relative dissonance of octaves and major thirds is probably why, with most traditional repertoire, the carillon sounds like shit. Okay, are you ready? I think it's finally time for us to create a consonant tritone. Now our goal here is to create a spectrum in which the partials line up really nicely when you transpose by a tritone. And so the natural way to do that is to stick some tritones in the spectrum, just like we saw with the minor third in the case of the carillon. This actually turned out to be a little bit more challenging than I thought it would be, because I didn't want the spectrum to just sound like a chord of sine waves. I wanted it to fuse together as a single note. At first I tried to do that by including some of the tritones that are actually present in the harmonic series, but in the end what worked best was to just model it after the carillon. Remember that with the carillon we started first with an octave, and then a minor third. So for my tritone timbre I decided to do the same thing. Start with an octave, and then a tritone. From there I actually followed the same volumes of the different harmonics that I had in the carillon, but with the pitches altered to be more tritone friendly. So here's another octave, and then a major third, and the tritone, and then another octave, and so on. I included the major third, by the way, to help give it some of that harmonic fusion, that sense of a single tone. And apart from the octave, that was the simplest harmonic ratio I could include, since I didn't want to include a perfect fifth. Okay, so check it out. Here's what our dissonance graph looks like and sounds like for our tritone sonority. Listen to that. That's a perfect fourth. It sounds terrible. And that's a perfect fifth. It sounds terrible too. And are you ready for the tritone? Do you hear the way that it locks in? It's a consonant tritone. I mean, kind of. Personally, I can't quite get rid of the association of that interval as dissonant, but listen again to the perfect fifth and the tritone. I think you can hear what you're seeing in the graph here, which is that these overtones, if that's what we can even call them at this point, are lining up because we've included tritones in the spectrum. By the way, remember how I included a major third in the spectrum? That sounds like this. And I think the real success here is, looking at this dissonance graph, apart from the octave, the most consonant interval is the tritone. So I hope you found that satisfying. I mean, I think the point of this video is for you to get a sense of how dissonance and consonance works in your ears, that sensory dissonance and consonance, remember? And if you ultimately find the consonant tritone that I created a little bit disappointing, that's okay. I mean, I'm a little disappointed, but it's okay. Anyway, to cap things off, I thought I'd play you a little bit of music, first using a regular sawtooth wave, and then using the consonant tritone sonority. So there you have it. That's how you make a consonant tritone. And if you're interested in playing with some of the things I built for this video, you can head over to my Patreon. I've put links to the Desmos graphs up there for free. But for the paid tier, I've compiled this program that I wrote so that it should work on your computer. It lets you play around with different spectra, and even load your own arbitrary spectrum to see what kind of intervals are consonant and which are dissonant. Oh, and if you still can't get enough of this after this already excessively long video, I have some extra goodies on my bonus channel. For example, as I alluded to earlier, some of you might have been able to hear that fifth lock in with true sine waves. Or did you? There's something interesting I discovered about that from experimentation. I also found some cool things from the simulations I made in this video that didn't quite fit in this video, but I thought would be good to throw up on the bonus channel. Finally, a couple thank yous. A lot of the ideas in this video ultimately came from the studies I did with Clarence Barlow, my former composition teacher who passed away a couple years ago. The way I measured dissonance for these different timbres is very much inspired by his program, Dissonometer. Also, the discussion of the carillon was particularly inspired by a talk by Jeff Trevino, a composer and composition professor who gave a talk some years ago when I was a grad student at UC Santa Barbara. Whew, can't believe I told myself that this was going to be a quick video that I'd throw together in a couple days.